Hello, everybody. I think that we are going to go ahead and get started right now. Um, Hopefully you all can see me here. My name is Kellyanne Nelson. I'm here with Chorus America. We're excited to have you here in the session. Whose pronoun is it anyway? I am the Advertising and Development Associate at Chorus America, as well as the founding Artistic Director of the Young Professionals Choral Collective. We're really glad that you're able to join us today, whether live or on replay, and I'll be your host, and I'll be joined by my colleague, Andre Coleman, Chorus America's Associate Director of Development, who will help manage any questions and chat throughout today's live video session. Everything Chorus America does, including this conference, is made possible through the generous support of choral music lovers like you. Please consider contributing to our 2020 conference campaign by texting CHORUS to 56512 and visit 32auctions.com/Chorus America 2020 to check out our one-of-a-kind auction packages. If you're joining us on Zoom for this live session, please feel free to use the Q&A button, and we'll try and get to your question during today's session. If you're watching this session on replay, we encourage you to post your questions or comments below in the comment box. Our speakers will stop back occasionally and answer questions as they're posted. We have a large group of amazing experts with us today, and it's my pleasure to share some small parts of each of their very compelling bios with you today. First up, Miriam Davidson is Artistic Director of Anna Crusis Women's Choir, a multi-instrumentalist, vocalist, singer-songwriter, author, and recording artist. She's directed the festival choir at the National Women's Music Festival. She's the music director of the Unitarian Congregation of Westchester, and she's on the board of directors of Gala Choruses. Miriam uses she and her pronouns. Shelley Collier teaches American Sign Language at Salesianum School in Wilmington, Delaware, an all-boys Catholic school where she's the founding faculty advisor for the Alliance, the first openly gay-straight alliance in a Delaware Catholic school. She also serves on the Diversity and Inclusion Task Force and works with the Director of Diversity to present on sex, gender, and identity. Shelley uses she and her pronouns. Bex Bagnato currently lives and works in New Jersey as a mental health care manager for youth with behavioral challenges with a focus on LGBTQ+ youth. From an early age, they have had a passion to educate people on the social justice and mental health issues particular to the LGBTQ community. They've been singing in Anna Crusis for the last 4 years and is a member of the board of directors. Bex is and uses the identification terms of dummy boy, transmasculine, and non-binary. Their pronouns are they or them, or he or him. The Reverend Julia Sheets, Julie, is ordained in the Presbyterian Church and serves as Associate Director of Campus Ministry for Ecumenical and Interfaith Outreach. She also teaches in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies and serves as a facilitator in the Intergroup Dialogue Program. Julie is a longtime singer in Anna Crusis and uses she and her pronouns. Emily Haney-Carone is an assistant professor of psychology at John Jay College of Criminal Justice and the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. She conducts research and teaches at the intersection of psychology and law with a particular focus on the juvenile justice system. Emily has been a member of Anna Crusis for more than 8 years, and the choir is both her primary outlet for artistic expression and one of her most important communities. Emily uses she and her pronouns. Please join me in welcoming our experts today.
Thank you so much for the introduction. We're very excited to be here and really excited to talk about the journey that our choir has taken with all of you. And so to get started, we actually would love to learn a little bit about who is in our audience today. And so if you can grab a cell phone or open a browser window on your computer, we wanted to start with a couple of poll questions. So to do these polls, you will open a browser and go to menti.com, menti.com. You can see it at the top of the screen here, and it'll ask you for a code. And the code that you should put in is 765105. And when you do that, you should be able to see this poll question that you're seeing on the screen here. and to be able to give your answer. So we'll give people just a couple of minutes to do that. After you submit your answer, keep that open because we have one more poll question that'll pop up when I change the screen. Great, so it looks like people are successfully doing this. Sorry about the sirens in the background. So again, menti.com, and the code is 765105. And if you can't make it work, no worries. It looks like we'll get a pretty good sense of who's in the room just based on this. Awesome. So it looks like we have people kind of coming from all different perspectives at all ends of kind of the spectrum of knowledge about trans and non-binary identities. So all the way from completely brand new to people who feel like they really know a lot and are already kind of experts in this area. So with that, I'm going to move it to the second question. And if you didn't get a chance to submit your response, no worries, you'll still be able to for the second one. So keep that link up. So the second question is, has your choir started to navigate issues of trans inclusion? So if you kept that link open, it should just pop up for you there so you can answer the second question. So this will really kind of give us an idea, right, of what point you're at in navigating this, so we can try to tailor, what we talk about today to what everyone's experiences are. So again, we'll give that just a couple of minutes. Great. So it looks like about half of the people in the audience, your choirs are kind of just at the very beginning stages. Either it hasn't come up or you're just starting to think about it or starting to address things. And half have made some decisions or made some kind of changes one way or the other, either deciding to be more inclusive or deciding not to be. So thank you for participating in that and giving us kind of that information. And we'll definitely kind of use that as a framework for thinking about the information that we can provide for those different points that your choirs might be on the spectrum. So some of the language, for those of you who are on the end of kind of just starting out learning about all of this, some of the language that came up kind of even in our introductions or in those poll questions might have been unfamiliar. So I'm going to turn it over to Bex to kind of give a brief overview of some helpful information before we dive in.
Good afternoon or good morning or whatever it is, wherever you're watching from. I'm Bex. Thanks, Emily. So I'm just going to go over a couple of terms that you might hear throughout the presentation and just to kind of get you familiar. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, as Kelly said, please go to the question and answer tab for Zoom so we can answer those at the end. So the first terminology you might be hearing a lot is gender identity. Gender identity is a person's deep-seated internal sense of who they are. It's who they identify as. It's kind of what we say, it's in the head, it's in the heart. It's not necessarily, when you hear hearts, not parts, it's really just who the person feels they are. This is different than biological sex. Biological sex is a person's combinations of genitals, chromosomes, hormones. It's usually characterized as male or female based on the inspection of genitals at birth. There are people who are intersexed who have combination of different chromosomes or ambiguous genitals. Biological sex and gender identity do not go hand in hand, and when they don't go hand in hand is when somebody may identify as transgender. A person who is transgender, they are a person who do not refer to themselves or feel that their gender identity matches their biological sex. Trans meaning opposite, gender obviously is of the gender they were born with. Another term we'll be using a lot is non-binary. It kind of falls under the transgender umbrella, but not all people who are non-binary identify as trans. Non-binary is a continuum or spectrum of gender identities and expressions, often that do not fall into the binary categories of male and female, hence non-binary. These are a wide range of genders. People who are non-binary may not identify as male or female, may identify as both male or female, or may not feel like they have a gender at all. And then, to speak to our topic, whose pronoun is it anyway? Pronouns, as a lot of people know, are the way we refer to an individual, as, he, she, they, them. Pronouns are something that we shouldn't assume about somebody based on their gender expression. Expression meaning how someone expresses their gender outwardly. It's very important that we don't act on those assumptions because it can potentially be harmful for someone. So it's important that, we start utilizing and normalizing asking people what their pronouns are or incorporating our pronouns. And when we refer to personal pronouns, we try to use personal pronouns versus preferred because preferred states that it's a choice when, you can't question somebody for who they are. So we use personal pronouns. It doesn't mean that that is necessary private information. So it's important to normalize that conversation. And that's what we started here with Anna Crusis to start our inclusion conversation. I'm going to kick it over to Miriam, who will start about what made us get to this point.
Yes, hello everyone. Thank you for attending this session. Several things happened for us all at once, probably in around 2016. I attended Gala Chorus's leadership symposium where I was presented with information about how to make your choruses trans-friendly, and had at a festival that summer was introduced to some trans composers and trans choirs, and also were people who were already in the choir who were in the process of transitioning, and also at some repertoire in our summer program made people comfortable, and I wasn't really sure why until some people came up to me and said, this piece that we're doing makes me feel uncomfortable because it uses a woman's body as a metaphor for other things, and we don't identify as women, and this song makes us really uncomfortable and we don't want to sing it. And I kind of went, okay, this is something that we need to start addressing as a choir in terms of including pieces that helped make everybody feel like they were more part of the process. So that's it. That's the short story about how our timeline and how we progressed from thing to thing.
So I'm just going to go over a little bit about our timeline, and my fellow Annas can jump in as needed if I miss anything. After we kind of had those conversations with Miriam around the musical aspect of some of the pieces we were singing, a group of singers started to form what we called coffee clutches. It was just kind of giving space for Annas to come meet before choir to discuss different concerns and issues, whether it was around musical repertoire, learning a little bit more about trans and non-binary identities and concerns and pronouns, or other important social justice issues such as race. From there, once May was over, we resumed conversations in the fall about identities at our retreat. We had a few Annas who are facilitators, facilitate conversations around, using pronouns, why pronouns matter, how, just normalizing that conversation can really make it more welcoming for individuals. We continued those conversations throughout fall 2016, and then in fall 2017, we really started to incorporate those specific things, such as including pronouns on name tags and during introductions. Meanwhile, we didn't really know how to go further, and from that small group that had those conversations around identity, we decided to have focus groups with a trans educator to really see where Anna was at that point. And those focus groups consisted of two groups that met. We had the legacy members, which we considered members who had been part of Anna for a longer period of time, over 5-10 years. And then we had a group of Annas who identified as trans or non-binary meet with this educator. And out of those specific groups, we kind of made a small plan, which included doing Trans 101, and that would happen in the spring of 2019. And also from those conversations in December 2018, that educator realized that he was not maybe the appropriate educator to continue the conversation. So we wrote a proposal to get another facilitator to come in. So we had 2 facilitators overall work with Anna on different levels, whether it was education and then kind of a processing and how to move on. We then had, in March 2019, we started the Trans 101 educational sessions. These consisted, I believe it was 2 sessions on Saturdays around 4 or 5 hours that we all met together and we did Trans 101 and kind of processing with that. In spring 2019, we met with the facilitator, the second facilitator, and expanded our team. That team expanded from a very small group of people, mostly who were on the side of wanting to be more trans inclusive, to a team of individuals that expanded everyone. It included new members, it included some of our legacy members. We really tried to make sure we had everyone's voice heard in that time. And from there, we then had process groups with the facilitator. I believe it was 3 or 4 process groups met because we needed to make sure everybody could try to make those groups. After the process groups, the full choir met with, the full choir. We had large meetings with that facilitator, with the full choir, and we then expanded the group in summer 2019 even more to a larger transition team, which we call Pulse. So if you hear us talking about Pulse a lot, Pulse would be that body of Anna singers who kind of are driving the force of, what's our next move. We developed some protocols and proposals out of those meetings to include the body of Anna. So we have little individual sections, our advertising and committee who would, talk about that kind of stuff, membership committees, and we included those committees as well. Finally, coming into October 2019, we presented those proposals and a plan for the fall retreat. And at that fall retreat, we brought to the whole choir, like, this is what we've been talking about. Some of those things we've been talking about. Do we vote on, Anna's name? Do we vote if we remain an SSA choir? Do we vote on how our membership would be? Once we had that conversations at the retreat, we realized we needed to take a step back and set a new timeline, which we will definitely we're going to discuss a little bit further in the process. So we realized that we kind of had to relook at what we were doing and meet the choir where they were at. We needed to not just go based on this facilitation model, but really kind of flow with how everyone was incorporating this, because we had extremes of people who were like, well, why aren't we doing this now? Why can't we just be inclusive? And people who were like, I'm not ready for this. So we're currently in the midst of that new timeline, which I said will be discussed a little bit later. And that's basically our timeline. And I'm gonna shoot it to Shelley for breakthroughs.
So one of the really interesting things that has sort of come out of this process is when we broke things down in that summer of 2019, we tasked different committees with different pieces of the process. And one of the pieces of the process, we tasked the committee called Breath. So as we, in Anna Crusis, we name our committees after different parts of the body. We call it the body of Anna. And the Breath Committee is our committee that is tasked with musical excellence. And a large part of that is selecting our repertoire. It's not just that, but that's a large part of what Breath does. And what Breath was tasked with doing is making a statement specifically about our musical philosophy and how our mission and our vision informs how we choose our music. Because what we were starting to realize was that a lot of what we do is inclusive, but it is not intentionally stated in a way that is understood both by all of the members and by all of the people outside who are looking in at Anna. Are we being transparent, and are we being intentional both to our internal members and to the people outside looking in? And so we were able to craft a musical philosophy statement. And that informed not only this trans inclusion process, but it also has informed other areas of our life as a choir, which has been a really interesting process. So part of our musical philosophy statement is here. The longer statement is part of the PDF that will be available to you and in the resources for this presentation. And it talks about why we choose the music that we do, how we choose the music that we do, the fact that every piece of music is not intended to represent the story of every member of Anna, but that we seek to represent parts of everyone's experience. Like we don't seek to, we know that not everything we do is going to represent each individual person, but we are part of a greater whole, and that our music is intended to create this tapestry. But also part of this musical philosophy statement recognizes that there may be times that a particular piece of music may cause tension. And how are we going to handle that tension? Because it was that tension that initiated this process in the first place. So part of this statement that is in the PDF that you can check out later is, so how are we going to deal with that tension? Not if it arises, but when it arises, because we recognize that part of living in a diverse community is that tension will arise, and that's okay. And we will create a way to deal with that tension. And so it's really been learning how to be intentional with how we handle that difficulty. And that's, I think it's really been a breakthrough for the choir as a whole.
Another breakthrough for us really kind of came out of that retreat that Bex talked about, where we were about 3 years into the process, and Pulse, our kind of transition team, came to the choir and said, right, like, this is what we're going to do. This is how we're going to move forward. Like, let's put this into action. And what we sort of got back from the choir a little bit was like, wait a minute, like, you guys have been talking about this for 3 years, but we haven't all been talking about it. And so at that point, we sort of realized that not everyone in the choir was on the same page, and not everyone was in the same place and being ready to move forward. And as part of kind of thinking about how to get people on the same page, we asked the choir to create this values word cloud. So the word cloud you see is the choir's responses to what are 3 words that you feel like are the core values of Anna Crusis. And so the vast majority of choir members submitted words for this, and the words that were submitted most often, you can see big in the center. So community, social justice, musical excellence, feminism, inclusion, diversity. And then you can see kind of many sort of spin-offs on those or themes around those floating around the edges. And as we created this with the choir, it really, I think, became a sort of solidifying moment where, even though we were in very different places in terms of the outcomes that we wanted or where we were in the process, this was a moment where everyone realized that we do really share these core values, and that these core values needed to inform the direction that we took in moving forward with the process. So this was a really critical piece to creating a kind of, I think, will in the choir to really tackle this head on, and creating the foundation of shared values to be able to do that productively. And then,
so in another piece of learning how to deal with the tension that happens in living in a diverse community, another piece that came out of that was creating this ombuds plan. And this is taking sort of another step above. So what if the conflict is not about a particular piece of music, but what if there's conflict within community? And how are we going to handle conflict within community? And we want to be really intentional about that. And so we are in the process of creating this ombuds plan. So sort of the breakthrough was the recognition that we need to be intentional about how to do that. And the fleshing out of that plan is still in process. But this is the beginning of what we are working on in creating this ombuds plan, and recognizing that the necessity of needing this plan of how to do it.
And as part of kind of this ombuds process, I think this was kind of a key piece in helping us really realize that both as a pulse team and also within the larger choir, we really wanted to separate out the decisions that we make as a choir about policies, about who will be in the choir and kind of the shape of the choir, versus decisions that we make about how we are in community and how we want to be with each other. And so we started being really intentional about separating out those ideas. And it became clear that everyone in the choir was all on the same page about how we wanted to treat each other. And so we had differences of opinion about choir policies, but we all wanted to treat each other with respect and use proper pronouns and do the things that made everyone in the choir comfortable together. And so I think that was a big breakthrough in realizing that we can have disagreement about policy without kind of intentionally creating a space that was hostile or unpleasant for anyone. And we also realized, I think, that there were policy decisions that the choir had consensus around. And so one of those core things was that we realized that it was critical for us to stay an SSAA choir, that was the one thing where there was consensus. And so we realized we had lots of decisions still to make, but that one we could take off the table. Everyone was on board with that. So I think those were kind of the key breakthroughs throughout the process. And that kind of leads us up to the present day, which I'll turn over to Julie.
Thanks, and thanks for your continued attention, everyone. So as Bex mentioned in the timeline, after the retreat we held last fall and the sense of some pushback from the choir of saying, you all have made this journey, but we need to be able to be more a part of it. We have kind of moved into the phase that we're currently in the last 6 months. And that began with a sense that it would be helpful for us to do a survey of the choir, just to get a better sense of where folks were, both in terms of their own practices regarding gender inclusion, and in terms of their perceptions of where the choir currently was. And some of the markers for that sense of inclusiveness were like, what kinds of flexibility do we have around concert attire, and as has been said several times, related to music choice, and also the focus of this whole presentation, are increasing comfort with use of gender pronouns. So we introduced that survey with the kind of affirmation that Emily just mentioned about kind of our core values as a choir, that we are committed to inclusiveness, that we respect the lived experience of every person, that we recognize that inclusion requires action beyond just good intentions, and the acknowledgement that change impacts our comfort zone. So we did this survey and then began a process of structured discussions, basically once a month with, we selected facilitators and worked with small groups that would remain the same throughout this process so that folks got to know each other and feel comfortable. And so we began with a discussion of the results of the survey and moved then into some education, first about the history of the choir and its connection to the women's music movement coming out of second wave feminism. We heard from members of the choir who had been, if not from the very beginning of our 45-year history, very close to that, and heard, so that we could bring everyone into this larger context of what the choir had been and how the current conversation connects with that. We've now moved into a more of a focus on the history of trans and non-gender conforming folks and the activism related to increasing awareness and inclusiveness. Our original plan for this process was that we would, by the end of this calendar year, be ready to make some decisions. And then COVID happened, so that may impact that timeline a little bit, but we're moving forward with it. Emily, do you want to pick up about the onboarding?
And so one of kind of the pieces that has similarly sort of been thrown into kind of a little bit of a more challenging situation in the midst of not being able to meet in person. But we really, as we are still in this period now, more than 4 years from the start of it, of figuring out what decisions Anna is going to make and what we want to look like as a choir and how we want to kind of live out our values of inclusiveness as a choir. Part of that has really been that, while we're in this transition period, we want to make sure that anyone that we bring into the choir that kind of missed the beginning stages is really ready to sit with this tension and to engage kind of with where the choir is now. And so we developed this statement that you can see on the screen that we provided to all members, all potential members who are interested in auditioning in our last audition cycle, and we'll do this again going forward, to make sure that people coming on board understood kind of what they were getting themselves into. This is a process that we're in the middle of that we're taking really seriously. And I think we also, in crafting this statement, really tried to reflect for potential members that we have ongoing tension within the choir between people who still feel like they're learning and they want to know more and they're not really ready for change, versus people who feel like, okay, like, we've been learning about this for years and now it's time for action. Let's move forward, let's make changes as a choir, and let's do this thing. And that tension's really been present from the beginning, but I don't think it is ever going to just be gone. And so as we bring people in, we try to also kind of hold awareness for that. And that's part of the process that we're in right now. And I guess that really brings us to kind of lessons learned and maybe what we would do differently if we had it to do over with what we know now. So I'll pass it to Miriam.
Yeah, one of the things is that if we had started from the beginning of the process with intentionality, that we knew this is something we were going to take on and we were going to be very deliberate about how we moved forward, instead of kind of, muddling through it and just kind of finding our way as things came up, I think it would have been less painful for the people that it impacted the most. And as a result of some of that muddling and pain, we lost some members. And if we had said something from the beginning that was like, we want to be really clear from the start that anyone who's in this choir has a place in this choir, no one would ever be asked to leave, no matter what was decided. I think that could have gone a long way in easing some tensions and avoiding a lot of pain that was caused with some members who chose to leave.
And I think that also I maybe would have made everyone in the choir kind of more aware of the acutely painful impact that these conversations were having on trans and non-binary members of the choir, who, really I think it would be impossible for them to be in the choir while we were having these conversations about who belongs in the choir and not feel pain, and for it to not be a damaging process. And so I think if we had recognized that from the beginning and kind of held space for that, we could have minimized the pain that we caused to people who were having to kind of bear witness to the choir's process of figuring this out, which is a really challenging thing to sit through.
I think it's important to remember, kind of just picking back real quick on that, the fact that, there's always intent versus impact, and that no matter, as a trans non-binary person, no matter knowing the intent behind actions and decisions and such, that impact is still going to happen. And that if even stating like, we're not going to ask anybody to leave, when you hear as a non-binary or trans person that the group that you have incorporated yourself into or come to know as your family made a conscious decision, not saying this is our decision, but just like putting it out there, if you're having these conversations and you have members who are trans and non-binary, that you make the conscious decision that you aren't going to include this inclusion, that no matter how much you say, we're not going to kick you out, there's still that impact of what the actual statement is. So just keep in mind, and like Emily and Miriam was saying, I think we would have held different spaces and allowed for different ways to process and not only include or not include those members who were affected directly.
And I think, thank you so much, Bex. I think that is very true, and I think is kind of one of the biggest things that we would do differently if we kind of had this process to do over. And I think, interestingly, also sort of on the other side of that, we realized at some point along the way that there was also some pain and some kind of, I think, fear and sadness and sense of loss for some of the members who had been in the choir for decades or since it started or close to that. And it was about really kind of fear that perhaps our identity as a feminist women's choir was going to be gone or going to change so much that they wouldn't recognize who we were anymore. And so from that, I think we also realized that at the same time as trying to minimize the pain and the harm that we were causing to trans and non-binary folks in the choir, we also could have mitigated some of that fear and pain that we were causing for members who had been in the choir for a long time by really holding our history as a feminist women's choir at the same time as kind of figuring out what we will look like in the future and how to move forward and live our values in the present time. So as part of that, that's part of the education process that Julie talked about, where we did the panel with the longstanding choir members. Here they are at that Zoom presentation. But we really have done work now to educate everyone in the choir where we come from and what our story is and what our history is as a choir. And I think doing that from the beginning could have been very helpful as well. And I guess maybe all of that really is, I think, summed up by saying that we could have approached this process more intentionally, that we really were reactive from the beginning, because we didn't know that we needed to be doing things until we knew that we needed to be doing things. And at that point, it was a little late to start responding. And so if we had this to do over, we would have started really intentionally and actively and intensely working on this process in 2016, or even before that when it first came up, instead of dragging it out for 4 years. And so we would encourage everyone who's thinking about this to start now, bring everyone in at once, get buy-in from the beginning and investment from the choir at the beginning, from the full choir, and continue to take the pulse of where everyone is at and check in with choir members to kind of get information. And so when we did a survey of our choir, this was kind of a really important takeaway, is that many people in the choir think that there's a disconnect between where we are in terms of being a supportive community and where we should be. And so getting information like this from your choir members can really help make sure that the process works for everyone and gets to where it needs to go.
And also, it's okay to get outside help earlier on. I think, you know, in hindsight, we put a little more on the members to do education. And that's okay. Like, you know, it's okay to get outside help, you know, and get facilitation who is, you know, not directly affected.
Yeah, and I think the benefit of getting outside help as soon as possible is that it can help from putting all of the labor of the process on trans and non-binary folks in the choir. That's an ongoing challenge for us. I think we continue to struggle with the tension between wanting trans and non-binary voices to be heard and be part of the process, but not expecting them to do all of the labor of educating and creating change within the choir. And so outside help from folks that you pay to do this work because it is part of their job is really, I think, critical, or at least thinking about ways to kind of minimize the burden on the folks who are most impacted by these changes.
And don't be afraid to start because you don't have answers to questions that you think you need to have in order to start, which is, I think, something that gummed up the works for us initially at the beginning as well. We all like to have some kind of a clear understanding of the questions we're going to ask and where we're going and where we're going to wind up. And that's the process. We just don't know, and we have to trust that process.
And so, Shelley and Julie, can you talk about what's coming next?
So, and I've been sort of scanning through the questions in the Q&A section, and this is something that a lot of you have asked about. One of the big things that is coming next is our legal name still is Anna Crusis Women's Choir, and that's how we exist as a legal entity. That is the face that's still how we present to the world. And we have not yet grappled, we have not yet completed the grappling with that issue. It is something that we are continuing to discuss. It is something that at some point the choir will need to decide, and it is not an easy answer. Historically, that is who we have been for 45 years. And there is not an easy answer for that right now. And I can't say that this is what we're going to be going forward. And it would be easy for us to say, oh, when we've solved this problem and here's the magic pill. And there isn't a magic pill for that. We have, as a choir, discussed different options. There will at some point most likely be a vote about what that will look like, but I can't tell you what that vote's going to be, what the result of that will be. But it is something that will be discussed in the future, because the face that you present to the world defines who you are. And so when people are looking at, do I fit into your group? When they see this name, that's very much a defining answer to that. And they can look at a picture and they can see a name, that if the picture and the name don't match, then that is some cognitive dissonance. And so that is an area that we have not solved yet. And maybe that's something we could talk about a little bit more in the Q&A section. But that is something that is coming in the future. Oh, go ahead, Julia.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
Well, do we have a statement on our website about who is eligible to audition? That's something that we've discussed. Do we make that statement? Do we not make that statement? It is something that has been discussed. It is not something that has been decided. We are not complete in this process. Like, we're still on the road. So we can't say we're done. We are in process, but we are not complete.
And I think we really recognized that no matter what the choir ends up deciding about who is in the choir, what our name is, and what our identity is moving forward, it is very likely that even if we, continue to make it very clear that everyone who's in the choir will always be welcome to stay in the choir, we probably are going to lose members. We are not going to be a comfortable space for everyone, potentially either direction, right? That if we make a move towards being as fully trans inclusive as we can be, there may be choir members who leave because it feels like the space is different from what they've known it as. And if we choose to not be fully inclusive, then even if we continue to welcome our existing trans members, of course, it's possible that people would feel like this isn't really a space where they are welcome. And so that is part of the thing that may be coming, is that we will have to grapple with, our choir is going to change no matter what decisions we make from this process.
And I think that also speaks to the reality that, yes, we will make these decisions at some point, but even that won't be the end of the process. That it will be an ongoing process of interpreting that decision and that understanding of who we are, that it will be kind of continuing work as new members come into the choir to help them understand the culture of the choir in that way, and that the work of the ombuds process of kind of addressing concerns as they arise for individual singers will be important, not just up until the time the decision is made, but continuing after that.
And one of the other things that has been discussed, especially recently, is that we have put so much effort into this inclusion work in this particular area, but there are a lot of other areas of diversity and inclusion work that we want to be equally intentional about. And that has been also an ongoing discussion, Anna, for years, but we want to be able to put the same kind of intentionality into ethnic diversity and racial diversity within our organization. And how can we take what we've learned in this area and use that to inform work in other areas? And that is very important, that we take that and use it in other areas.
And with that, I think we are ready to move into Q&A. And so I will turn it back over to the facilitators, although I did want to quickly note, I saw one question asking if you'd be able to see the slides. I don't think are planning on posting the slides, but we have provided a PDF of resources that's much more robust than the slides, that includes the survey questions that we use to kind of take the pulse of our choir, the proposal from the facilitator that we hired, a bunch of educational resources that we've provided to our members, the musical philosophy statement. So pretty much anything you might want from the slides should be in there. And if not, you can always reach out to us and we can provide it.
Awesome. That's fantastic. And I'll make sure that everybody has information about where they can access those kinds of things along the way. This has been an awesome discussion. I'm especially grateful for you sharing a process that is organic, that you spoke to this fact that it was reactive as you moved on, and you're sharing your lessons that you've learned. And so many people obviously are interested in sort of having a proactive process because we're seeing lots of great questions that are popping up. The first one that I wanted to throw out there is actually from a children's choir. And I know that, or a girl choir, I should say. I know that you guys work with different ages, but I think it's an important question, this idea of any thoughts about things that youth choruses can do specifically to support young singers whose identities might change as we know them, and any advice on being proactive in that conversation with parents instead of being reactive to specific students, something that they can sort of guide folks through if that's experiences you've had. I also do want to highlight that we have about 5 questions to ask and about 10 minutes to do that as we're planning.
So I'll just jump in real quick around this one, only because I work with trans youth, and anybody else obviously on the panel who have experience. I think one is really to, if you have a youth who is in your choir who's come out as trans or non-binary or even gender non-conforming, speak with them, because one, you don't necessarily know if they've come out to their parents. I think it's important to navigate whether or not they have, because they might just need an adult that they respect and trust to have those conversations with. As far as navigating that, it's pretty, it's kind of difficult, because children who are transitioning can range from, kids who are, on hormone blockers to kids who are just, socially transitioning, which mean they've changed their name. Really, you have to feel the pulse of yourself, your choir, and the people around you. I can include in some of the resources, some specific resources for trans youth and their families. One that's really good is the Gender and Family Project. It's out of the Acronym for Family in New York. They hold a conference every year that includes a day just specifically for family and youth that kids can go, and a day for professionals. And they often have many different discussions around, working with youth who are trans and non-binary. Another one that is also really good is Gender Spectrum. This particular question I think is a lot harder because it's very individualized, but I would really, discuss it with the youth. If the youth is comfortable with the family, discussing with the family. If the youth is going to transition completely socially, you have that discussion whether or not they're the right fit if you are a full gender, one gendered, choir identification, because they just might not feel comfortable with that. It's a lot of those issues are very much the same as you would be having an adult gendered choir conversation, but to really just support the youth as much as they can. And you can always contact us somehow. I'm sure our contact information will be somewhere for more resources regarding that.
If I could just throw in a couple more things, just some simple shifts in language. So instead of referring to the choir as girls, referring to them as singers, or other non-gendered words, because I found in my classroom in this all-boys school, the convention at our school is to refer to the students as gentlemen. Well, I've had 2 students now come out to me as trans, and I feel very uncomfortable using that language with them, knowing that I have a variety of gender identities in my classroom. So finding ways just to shift your language, not even knowing who's in your classroom, it can make such a difference to a student you might not even know. So to find those ways to use non-gender specific terms.
Yeah, words matter for sure. I want to highlight one question here that there was some people looking to know what kind of pushback you might have heard from choir members who maybe were resistant to the choir becoming trans inclusive. Are there any stories or anecdotes to share about that?
I think one of the things that emerged fairly early on in our conversations was a kind of tension, as I sort of understood it, as a kind of tension between our identifying ourselves as a feminist choir and a choir committed to the feminist values of inclusion and attention, a special welcome to those on the margins, and the identity as a women's choir, and particularly, you know, in the early years of Anna's establishment, being a safe women's space, which was so important, particularly, you know, at that time. And so I think some of the resistance is out of a deep kind of commitment to that understanding of women's space and safe space. And then I think also, you know, there's some sense from some folks' reaction, I think that, you know, that this can become a slippery slope. And does this mean that eventually we will have cisgender men in our choir, which I think is not really on the horizon or likely in any way. But I think there is a sense that once you cross this line, things, you know, the total character of the choir could change.
You know, so in looking at some of these other questions, it's so interesting to see, you know, how many pieces this conversation continues to grow and expand, right? So we're talking about the idea of what does inclusion mean? How does that impact identity, both as an organization, both as a person? How does that impact voicing? You just sort of made reference to the fact of different sort of voicing or identities that come in. There's even a question here about how these kind of findings and this kind of exploration of identity impacts race. Are there any further conversations, especially as it leans into sort of that pedagogical voicing or into conversations about further inclusion, whether that impacts race, identity, gender, et cetera? Are there any pieces of that you'd be willing to share?
Really quickly about the voicing issue is that Anna traditionally has a very low alto section. So we would audition anybody, once we defined who we were open to, we would audition anybody like we do everybody else. If they're a fit for the choir vocally and spiritually and personality wise, then they're a fit, and it doesn't really matter.
Although around that, I guess we've talked about the possibility of, right, I see questions about how do you, what do you then call yourselves, right? And so we've talked about calling ourselves an SSAA choir or an SSAA choir with extended range, or we've talked about naming a specific range, right? That we are a choir of singers who sing between this note and this note. And I don't think that there's one right answer. I think there are a lot of ways to voice it and a lot of ways to talk about it. And I think the really critical piece is being really intentional and thoughtful about coming up with language that reflects being open to the people that you want to join you, to make sure that the language that you're using doesn't signal to people that you do want to include that they don't belong in your space.
You know, I think it's really interesting, especially as we're coming toward the end here, of how many different questions leaned in toward the name and that idea of sort of how do you see yourself? Where does that go? And I'm seeing questions with names specifically relating to SSA, women, feminist, all of those pieces of things. And I think you guys have addressed a number of pieces of that, but I think, you know, that idea that words and seeing yourself in a space really matter. Before I wrap this up, is there any last thought that we weren't able to cover today that you would like to share with our participants?
I saw the question about how we'll use our learnings to create greater inclusivity with regard to race. And I think that is a critical question that I didn't want to leave unaddressed. And I think the answer is, totally honestly, we don't know, except that we know that it's time, way, way, way past time for us to do that in a much more focused and kind of direct and intentional and effortful way. where it's a conversation that Anna has been having for literal decades. And at this point, it needs to stop being just like an ongoing passing conversation and needs to be a really critical central focus. And so I think we're figuring out what that looks like, but hopefully it looks like a very in-depth, intensive process, maybe sort of modeled off of the trans inclusion process that we're doing now, where we dig in and grapple with the ways that we are falling short and figure out how we can do it better.
And I think in terms of a couple specific learnings, I think we have a better recognition of how issues of privilege and marginalization are a part of this work, and also the awareness of the need not to have those who are traditionally have been marginalized or minoritized be the ones to do the labor for the rest. So those are just two things that I think are transferable to that conversation.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing the journey, your findings. This has been really fantastic. I want to just make sure that we thank our fabulous panelists, Beck Spagnato, Shelley Collier, Miriam Davidson, Emily Haney-Carone, and the Reverend Julia Sheets for sharing this excellent information with us today. And thanks to everyone for your great questions. I know we're all very excited to take this information into the world and use it in our own spaces. Additionally, since your staff hosts from Chorus America here today both work in development, we would be remiss if we didn't mention that this is our conference campaign. And thanks to everyone who has contributed so far at the beginning of this session. Here's the info again, just in case you didn't catch it the first time. You just have to text Chorus to 56512 to make a contribution today. Thank you again to everybody. Make sure that you check out the new Zoom links for our Composer Showcase, and we'll see you throughout the conference.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.